Throwing a Shadow by Jay Wilburn. Again, I wrote the first draft on stream, and now I'm going to begin an edit with several details that need to be added in. A lot of missing pieces. Pull together what's already in the story. Alright, so let's begin the first paragraph. John Orman became the oldest man in the world 61 years ago. This morning, late morning already, he sat in the chair shaped to him by time and stared through the open blinds to trees and sunlight outside. His eyes were still good. John's plumbing was top notch. Getting old was different these days, but primarily it just took a fellow a little longer to do. He tried to place the house outside the window. It wasn't always the same one, and he had trouble remembering this one. He couldn't recall if either of his wives had lived there with him. Maybe the second one. Maybe. His best guess. Alright, let me spell that out. His best guess was this. His best guess was, let me put another word in there, was that this one was the house where his youngest son and oldest granddaughter had lived out their final days. They had all shared the same nurse. That's not what you expect when you have kids. Alright. It was probably that house, but John didn't remember it being blue. Alright. His friend took hold of his wrist, and let's say his left wrist, and turned the bracelet there. What does Icliffe's, I'm gonna invent a disease here. What does Icliffe's, is it two F's? Yeah, I did that on purpose. What does Icliffe stand for? Stand for again, John. John licked his lips, but kept his eyes on the blue house so it wouldn't disappear. Feedback loop syndrome. No, that isn't it. No, that isn't it. His friend's grip faded away instead of letting go. right. It's inhibitory, control, loop inducing. Inventing a disease here just for the purpose of this story. Loop inducing flexible feedback syndrome. I think they named it just for the acronym. John sniffed and let the view of that old blue house go. They just called it going senile in my day. Your day hasn't ended yet, old man. John smiled. He leaned over to make a, let's say, crude comment to Abram. Alright, now we're back into the story that's already been written. But of course he wasn't there. Couldn't be. They were born too close together, and everyone John knew growing up had passed a natural lifetime ago. He wasn't sure why he always forgot Abram Apollo was gone. He had 2 wives for several decades each, but he never leaned over to tell them some random thought anymore. He thought of his kids and grandkids a lot. He usually pictured them as adults. Their actual childhoods were fuzzier. More gaps between memories. Alright, let's go and spell that right just because I want to. Alright, there we go. Alright, I need to pull this into a new paragraph now. Nanites cleaned his neurons regularly, but the brain was the one organ they couldn't regrow for you. Alright, I'm going to pull this up into the same paragraph because it talks about rare organs. He had new kidneys, lungs, liver, spleen, and he was on his 3rd heart. They just grew the stuff in printers using his own cells. John knew, being the oldest person, let's say ever, came with privileges. Doctors a fraction of his age took it as a challenge to keep him going. It was the competition, nothing personal. Project 1000, they called it. Get people to live 1,000 years. Sounds good in the ads, but even John Orman had trouble imagining that. If they let old man Orman up and die, the project might lose funding. So he was the liver spotted. So So he was the liver spotted poster boy. Poster boy for, let's make a short for this, P1K. Alright, so he was the liver spotted poster boy for P1K. His skin was actually pristine most of the time, but the analogy was good enough. Alright. John turned his head from his sunken chair. The nurses moved about behind them. Not behind them, let's say him. They always had business even when they weren't poking or scanning him. He didn't know their names anymore. They'd tell him in a way that had the thickest of kind veneers over it, but he'd been through too many to keep. He'd been through too many generations of them to keep from mixing up the names. He had prided himself on remembering names and details about people back when he was a working man 2 centuries ago. Professionally and personally, he stored and recalled details about marriages, divorces, children, birthdays, anniversaries, hobbies, and such for just about every person he encountered, even briefly. He still remembered a bunch of that stuff: long dead clients, golfing scores, favorite teams of his nephews and great-great-grandchildren, and favorite colors of old business partners of an old business partner's 3 children. All of it was pretty useless stuff when they were so many generations dead. He didn't remember much about elementary or high school. Friends from college onward were clearer, but that wasn't so unusual even for young folks in their first century of life. Was it? Every time you moved to a new place or a new phase of your life, some of those details got left behind. Other bits of memory came with you, but they had nothing to anchor to in your new life. So they faded from neglect. Had a couple few more centuries on, and you repeated that erasure several times over. Abram spoke out from the empty air to John's left side. If they knew Hey, man. Thank you for using using the emote. It just came through the other day. I'm gonna have a few more coming in for the bits and all that stuff, loyalty badges and all that. We're working out all that. We finally decided my face is gonna be the base model for all that stuff we designed. So thanks for coming in and letting me see those live, man. That was cool. So Abram spoke out from the empty air to John's left side. If they knew you were seeing old houses out those windows, that band on your wrist would be red instead of yellow. Maybe I should tell them. Let me capitalize maybe. Alright, maybe I should tell them about you, John said. They might lock me away for good. Then let me have John whisper. John whispered as softly as he could. They might lock me away for good. Lock me away for good then. Abram gave a huff and asked, why do they use paper bands still when they got you chipped? For a moment, John could see through the current medical staff at his care center. They still moved. Their steps echoed from floor to walls, and their voices rang clear, but he could see the furniture on the other side of them through their bodies and uniforms. He wanted to tell himself it was all in his head, but the view lasted too long to dismiss outright. Outliving your doctors over and over is a bitch, John grumbled. From the empty, clear as day. Okay, let's say from the empty sofa. From the empty sofa, clear as day, and just like his old self, Abram said, I'd miss my mechanics and handymen more. Anyone can look after your ticker. It's the engine and the little things you like around your house that take too much retraining. I miss my wives and children more, John said. John didn't bother. Okay, I've already done John. Let me switch this to he and see if it doesn't mess things up. He didn't bother to linger on the couch as he turned his head forward again. Abram Apollo died back before living over a century became the rule instead of the exception. No, they can't replace your brain no more, no matter how wonky it starts to get. So John changed the subject. No, they can't replace your brain no matter how wonky it starts to get. Abram, long dead, John reminded himself, agreed. Yeah, centuries of data might be a bit much to ask of that wet sponge in your skull. Especially with the eye cliffs you keep hiding from them. Alright, moving on. John Ormond, oldest man in the world by nearly a half century, stood up without much more protest from his knees than they'd given in his late 40s. Still, he winced. He decided to go for a walk without telling anyone, even though he'd been classified a fall risk for well over 70 years. The red band, would it be red? The red band on his, let's make it yellow. The yellow band on his right wrist warned the staff about falls. The one on his left told them to watch for the brain disease invented after people started living for centuries on the regular. Alright, good enough. His bones were artificially strong, more plastic than calcium. His skin was relatively tight and new with all the treatments, and his third heart was still as strong as ever. He ran his fingers through hair that felt more real than when he was a kid. Let's say it's still stuck up in weird ways that John had always associated with old men's hair. Okay, Abram's ghost stayed on the couch but called to John's back. How many boards can they replace on a ship before they have to rename it? John didn't bother to answer as he hoped his dead friend's voice remained behind for this trip. Alright. None of the staff stopped him. They acted like he was more transparent than they looked to him this late morning. Let's put a comma there. Late into his years. He glanced down and back to be sure he still cast a shadow. All right, I need to remember to put that in. That's kind of a theme here, and I only mention it here. It was the only thing he did consistently these days without someone stepping in to help. It also reminded him of what was real and what was some piece of his mind he couldn't quite clear out. Okay. Alright, he got as far as the front door without so much as a word from anyone else. Then he couldn't remember the code. He was allowed to know, he just kept forgetting. Numbers were worse than names. He knew his student ID number from college. He remembered 7 different combinations of various lockers and mailboxes from his much younger days. He could pull up a Rolodex worth of phone numbers spread out over a profane amount of time, but not the code for the front door. Probably not one of these young brats know what a Rolodex even is. To be fair, they were well-trained medical personnel and full adults, even if only a fraction of his age. Also, Rolodexes were outdated in his time too. Alright, good enough. Okay, John peered through the glass longingly. Good old-fashioned Rolodex. I may fit a card catalog in here before it's over. Let's see how this goes. John peered through the glass longingly. It was starting to drizzle anyway, he told himself. So he walked the perimeter hall of the facility. People started to appear more solid, but still strangers. John got company from time to time. People had fewer kids these days. He tracked it in a computer program in his room with his own family tree. It got confusing because the oldest members of one generation tended to overlap the youngest from another. Let's say it got confusing because, let's say, after enough time, the oldest members of one generation tended to overlap the youngest from another. And God knew he'd had enough time. Alright, I like how this is fleshing out. I think it's going to be good by the end. He had recently lived long enough to see the 10th generation of his descendants born into the world. They named the boy Ormond. There were dozens of Johns and Ormonds scattered about his family tree now. Alright, this new little guy was the youngest, born to an unwed mother attached to a punk of a guy who would make their days miserable. Tina, the first generation 9 to have a baby, brought the kid up for John to see. The media took pictures, video, and whatever the other mediums were. The other new mediums were. Then everybody left. Little Ormond, the littlest Ormond was born on John's birthday to boot. God help him and his too young mother. Alright, John had seen it happen slowly. It was the 4th generation where it really started. The first generation with great as a time divider starts to view the old man lingering around as something between a novelty obligation and a melting monster. As the generations went on, family essentially became strangers. As he looked at a generation in his charts as one level of descendants, we'll say all connected to him through people he knew and loved well. The people on one end, of a generation wouldn't recognize the others for anything. Why would they? They were separated by hundreds of years to their closest shared relative in some cases. Being related to the oldest man in the world was like tracing your lineage to George Washington. It was an interesting piece of trivia, but not a relationship. All right. I'm adding a piece in here because there was something missing. John realized something was wrong. He pulled up short in a bedroom doorway. Looking back down a short hallway, he saw a stand-up combo washer and dryer. Pictures on the wall looked familiar. It's not a comma there, but vague in his memory. he looked down on the floor for a shadow, but it was too dark to see his. Alright. This was another house. This one he remembered. It was the last house he lived in with his first wife, and then for a while after she was gone. Their kids wished that he had died instead of her. She was great, but that was a heavy burden to carry, even with grown children. One of them had said as much. He apologized later, but John would never forget that confirmation of what he already knew to be true. He made his way through the bedroom looking for the back door to the house. He walked into a stuffy office instead. It took him a moment, but he recalled adding this room onto the back. This house only had one door in and out. Such an oddity. As he made his way through the laundry hall, he found himself back in the familiar halls of the facility. Taking a couple deep breaths, he checked the floor and found his shadow again. Back to reality, he said. Good job, old boy. He made it down the long hallway to the south end of the building. Alright, now we'll jump back into where the story was. I think I filled that out well. I may not need to add anything more other than what's already here. John turned a corner and faced a set of wooden doors. When was the last time he saw wooden doors? Not in this place for sure. He took hold of the knob, a thing which preceded handles, which preceded sensors, which preceded coded maglocks. The thing turned easily enough, muscle memory so old that it sparked painful nostalgia, recognized the feel of the analog mechanics inside the door. Okay, John Orman, oldest man in the world by far, opened the door that shouldn't have been there. He stepped into his... Okay, hold on. I'll add one more thing here. It never occurred to him that he could reject this thing that felt real enough and just go back the way he came. Alright. Good enough. He stepped into his grandparents' house from what would have been the garage. Let's say their garage. Their garage. It opened to where the kitchen met the living room with its thick carpet. Alright, moving along. Hello. His voice bounced in a way that told him the house was empty. There was no real reason he should have been able to know that, but the place shouldn't have been here either. Alright, let me say this. He didn't bother to check for his shadow. He wasn't in Kansas anymore. Any of you punks know that reference? Okay, let's leave it at that. The smells were shockingly familiar, like traveling through time by being punched in the sinuses. They weren't old, abandoned smells. It was fresh cooking, even though he could see for himself that the impossible kitchen was empty. It made sense. Every memory he could pull up from this place, most of them oddly vivid now that he was standing in here again, involved people long gone. His grandparents lost this house before John was old enough to shave, but years felt longer back then when they represented so much of a larger portion of his life. He stared. Okay, hold on. Winter is. Let's not make it negative. Summer. Let's have him say this. Summer is eternity when you are young enough. Alright. Summer is eternity when you were young enough. I like that. He stared at the glass table that had been shattered in his first apartment at a party that got out of hand. The grandparents were long gone by then, and their stuff spread out to, let's say, grandchildren who cared less than they had. He recalled being very young at his father's feet under this table, looking up at the man's face, distorted through the fancy glass top. His second brother was still an infant on his father's lap. His third brother and his only sister were yet to be born. His sister Olivia lived to a ripe old age by the standards of the time. But John and her were the only half... Oh, it should be she. Tricky grammar. But John and she were the only half of the kids who did. Michael, the baby in the lap, struggled with heart issues his whole life and died before 20. Mark, the one still to come, would be a police officer less than a month before he died in a car accident off duty. He barely made it to let's say 21. I think that's the minimum age to become an officer. If they let you into the academy younger, I think in most places you have to be 21 to become a police at the time of graduation to become a police officer. So we'll say 21. John couldn't even relate to a life that short. It was like trying to understand someone who never stopped being a baby. His grandfather sat, let's say had, his grandfather had sat at the table that day. Aunts wandered in and out. John's mother came and took Michael to change him and administer his heart meds. John's dad and grandfather discussed the grandmother's health issues. They argued quietly over the right thing to do. Let's say with their fists balled upon the glass above young John Orman's head. The men, I'm not going to say dead men. The men spoke and cursed one another without thinking about John listening. In the end, his grandmother had outlived both of them, and John outlived everyone. He turned away. Old man John, who did not belong here, turned away and exited the door that shouldn't have opened on this. He feared he'd get lost in these empty places where he was the last witness of what had passed. He stepped out of the house, but not back into the facility like he had hoped. John stared up at the bright ceilings high above him. With the place empty, he could hear the fluorescence buzzing. Alright, did I spell that wrong, or it just wants me to capitalize it? Okay. Fluorescence. That was a strange sound in a world of silent and streamlined things in a future he never expected to live long enough to see. Staring at the carpet, he finally placed the hotel this was in. It was one of his favorite work conventions. This one was full of old friends and good memories. Probably 7 years interrupted by a couple years in the middle during one of the pandemics that tended to hit the world once a century. There had been many hotels before and since, many events that were fun, but few that came close to matching these heady days. The early years were better than the later ones. I'll say the early years of this event were better than the later ones. A cacophony of conversations leaked from the hall to his right. When he turned his head to identify voices he almost recognized, he could almost recognize. I think that flows a little better. Alright, he could almost recognize they were gone, and the room was obviously empty. He made hundreds of friends in this place, and that probably looked... He made hundreds of friends in this place that now probably looked nothing like this anymore, if it still stood at all. All of them were gone. Like the kid under the glass table surrounded by ghosts he once loved, no one remembered these moments or conversations besides him. A baby cried somewhere deeper in the dead hotel, and that chilling noise drifted down to silence slower than John liked. He tried... Okay, let me add something in here. If that didn't stop, he might need a fourth heart before this was over. Let me do a new paragraph here. All right. He tried to think whether these years would have included someone born who might still be around. It was really close. Anyone he knew over the first 50 plus years of his life were gone. Most after that were gone too. Is that right? Most. Okay, let's say most he knew. Most he knew after that were gone too. The oldest people. Say the oldest survivors. In time. Alright. The oldest survivors of marching time besides him were mostly women, but men too, who were scattered across the globe. These were not his buddies from the old neighborhood, nor his friends from the industries he called his own, for what turned out to be such a small portion of his life. Part of him was glad he'd given up the grind before science kept pushing back retirement age. Computers took care of a lot, but automation and plenty didn't overcome the human urge for fairness, even if that meant harder life for everyone. People want everyone to suffer equally, or at least as bad or worse than they imagine they have suffered. It was old dead Abram Apollo in his ear again. Yeah, I'm not going to have him say anything. John was actually kind of glad for his familiar delusion. How do I get out of here, Abram? Should have stayed in your chair, old man. Screw you. Take it easy. Your sense of humor is so fragile sometimes. Everyone I know is dead, Abram, including you. Now I'm getting lost in my own head. All right, stay cool. You know where the lobby is. Go out that way. The door I came in is behind me, though. That one's going to keep changing. Go out the exit you know. John walked through the spooky, empty hotel he used to love once a year. The lobby doors blazed bright with sunlight, washing out the exterior. These doors opened for him, and John stepped into the hallway of his facility again. It was shorter to keep going around, but he decided to backtrack anyway. As he passed the front door, it stood wide open. That made no sense because it should have slid into the wall, not swung on hinges like in the old days. Before John could dwell on that too much, Abram revved the engine of his old Ford. Blue exhaust boiled up from the back. That meant something was leaking where it shouldn't, but John supposed a car that was long scrapped in reality that now sat running in front of his care facility was the bigger impossibility. All right, I'm going to read that again and make sure it actually makes sense. That meant something was leaking where it shouldn't. I'm going to stop. I'm going to break that sentence there. It doesn't need to be any longer. Where it shouldn't be. Alright, that meant something was leaking where it shouldn't be. John supposed a car that was long ago scrapped in reality that now sat running in front of his care facility was the bigger impossibility. Abram was behind the wheel with the passenger's door open for John. The old man was young again with pimples and years to spare. Hop in, let's have fun again, old man. Don't think I'm ready for that trip just yet. Who you holding on for? Is that how he would say it? Who are you holding on for? Let me change that. Let's say, what are you holding out for? Who else are you expecting to see? John shrugged and his shoulders ached. He'd probably ask for another nanite injection tonight, unless, of course, he took this ride with Abram. His friend revved the engine one more time in invitation. Not today, John whispered. Maybe next time. Not today, John whispered. He turned the paper bracelets. He turned the paper bracelets on his wrists. His shadow was there, sprawling out behind him, but it was awfully thin. Really, it could go either way at this point. Alright, I like that. Brought the shadow back in one more time. I don't think I had him look for a shadow in the hotel. Maybe next time. Abram tore away in a cloud of dust without bothering to close the door. John watched him go before he returned to his seat. The oldest man in the world watched the colors out the window change with the moving sun. He'd watched this dance countless times, but it was still beautiful, and he grew one day older. Alright, so that is the story there. Let me go back to the hotel scene and add a shadow reference in. So we were at the house, carpets of the hotel. Alright, let me get down to the fluorescence because we did talk about the lights. Okay, here we are. John stared up at the bright ceiling above him. With the place empty, he could hear the fluorescence buzzing. That was a strange sound in a world of silent and streamlined things. He checked for his shadow, but couldn't make it out. Checked for his shadow, but couldn't make it out. Did fluorescent lights cast shadows? He couldn't remember. It had been too long. Alright, I think maybe I need one more shadow reference at the end, and then I'll do it. Still going to need to reread this and do some edits offline eventually, but I feel good about how I filled this out this time. Alright, the oldest man in the world watched the colors out the window change with the moving sun. He'd watched this dance countless times, but it was still beautiful. Shadows grew long as the day grew. Let's say let me use something besides grew. Shadows stretched long as the day aged. That'll do it. Alright. Shadows stretched long as the day aged, and he grew one day older. Alright. That's pretty good. I think there's some good hitting lines there. I think it's interesting exploration of what it means to get much older than anyone else in the world ever has, and how technology would fit in. But I think it's still like a very I think it's still a pretty close narrative into the personal life of who would be the oldest man in the world and what that would be like in a world where that turned out pretty well.